I'm just gonna make sure I'm not muted. You guys can hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about what's now known as post-acute COVID syndrome, which that's the medical term for it, but I think we all know it as long COVID. And so I'm just gonna kind of go through this. It's more of a descriptive. This isn't like a medical talk, so I'm going to try and make it just pretty folksy and that just kind of give you the bare basics of all this. So I have nothing to declare as far as conflicts go. I'm not paid for any of my work. Oh, you're going to fix that. So when COVID started, we thought of it as this acute disease, right? You got sick, you got some kind of pneumonia, you ended up in the hospital, you lived or died based on whether your lungs were functioning. For kids, we pretty early on discovered that there was another element to this, that after they had COVID, they could have this thing called MIS-C, which is multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, where basically their inflammatory system went all out of whack, started attacking the organs, and some kids died. A lot of kids ended up in the ICU. It was a very serious, debilitating illness. But that wasn't all. After a while, we learned there was something called long COVID. And this is, by definition, this is the WHO definition. So you have to have a history of confirmed infection, and then at least one system that persists for more than 12 weeks after the initial testing, which cannot be explained by another diagnosis and affects everyday functioning. And it can either start during COVID and persist or start to come on afterwards, so weeks to months after you've had the infection. And it can wax and wane. It's not there all the time. It's not like your nose is running constantly. It comes and goes. So there are varying definitions as to what long COVID is. The CDC in the United States uses 4 weeks as that cutoff. The WHO uses 12 weeks. So I'm just going to use the WHO definition for ease. But maybe because of those varying definitions, we have a huge, wide range of prevalence from this. So basically, prevalence means how many people have this in a population. And the population we're talking about is those who have had COVID. So you have COVID, what percent of people will go on or what percent of kids will go on to have long COVID? And it goes anywhere from 2%, which is relatively small, to 66%, which is massive. Does anybody here know a kid with long COVID? Kid in your class, maybe? What about adults? Everybody know adults? Yeah, more prevalent with than adults with the kids, more prevalent with adolescents than with little ones. So just for ease of numbers, let's just say that it's probably somewhere between 3 and 10% of first infections at 90 days, using our definition. So Goja's already presented a different version of this slide. This is the seroprevalence study out of British Columbia, and I'll just kind of walk you through it. So for the youngest age groups, and you can see it here. So this is 0 to 4, 5 to 9, and then 10 to 19. And then these different symbols are eras. So if we just look at September, October 2021, which is this triangle, there was almost no kids that had COVID in September of last year. And of course, as you know, last year was the year where we just removed all the masks. And so it went from, in these age groups, somewhere around 12%, 13%, to in all age groups up to 76%. And you can see here that the kids have the highest prevalence in July, August of 2022. So they went from a very low prevalence to a very high incidence of COVID. And what does that mean? So let's just take the BC data, and we're pretty equivalent as far as how we treated COVID in our schools, and let's just apply it to Alberta. So population of Alberta, 4.3 million. Under 19, we have just over 1 million kids, which is amazing. So if 80% of kids got infected, that means we had around 850,000 kids that were infected in that period up to September of last year. If it's a 2%, so we're going to take the very low end, 2%, that means we have 17,000 kids with long COVID. And 10%, it's 85,000. So we're talking big numbers here. These aren't like 2% is a relatively small number, but when you apply it to a huge population, it ends up being a large number. So who's higher risk? Females, older, especially adolescents, and then we're just talking about kids. And if your infection during the acute phase was severe enough, especially to be hospitalized or go to the ICU, then you had an increased risk of the long COVID. So there's over 60 different symptoms that are associated with long COVID. The most prevalent is fatigue, but then we also have short of breath, loss of smell and taste, headache, rash, post-exercise, unwell. So you go exercise, you come home, you just feel really off. Brain fog is a euphemism for cognitive dysfunction. Let's call a spade, like these kids' brains aren't working as well as they should be. And this interesting entity called POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which means that when you're upright, your heart tends to really overcompensate and race, and it can cause quite debilitating symptoms. Aside from those symptoms associated with long COVID, we have real illness associated with it as well. Myocarditis, I'm sure you've heard about. Mostly you've probably heard about it to do with vaccines, but it's really important to recognize that COVID itself causes much more myocarditis and more severe myocarditis than the vaccines ever did. Pulmonary embolism, that's a clot that's traveled into your lungs, got kind of corked in one of those blood vessels and limits the amount of oxygen exchange that can happen. Strokes, we're seeing more strokes in kids, type 1 diabetes, and acute renal failure. And of course, there's depression and anxiety. And maybe Angela can speak to this, but it's kind of a combination of, we think, the actual illness causing the depression and anxiety. But as you probably imagine, if you're debilitated from some of these symptoms, that in turn can bring on anxiety and depression. It's not fun being disabled, essentially. So why is this happening? There's 5 ideas as to why people are getting long COVID. We don't really know if it's specific ones for specific symptoms, or if it's a combination, or maybe there's one predominant and we just haven't figured it out. But there is evidence of persistent infection. You can actually measure COVID RNA in people that have long COVID. Microclots. So we know this is a vascular illness. Maybe there's some really small clots that are forming and going through and causing injury. Inflammatory response, your body is overreacting or underreacting. We actually have an idea that maybe there's some immune dysfunction that comes from this. Reactivation of latent viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, which is a virus that's associated with what we used to call fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome. Now we call it, I'm going to forget the name, myalgic encephalitis. And then, of course, that initial infection could have caused long-term damage as well. So I'm just going to show some pictures of kids, because I think it's really important that we recognize that these are real people and not statistics and not just numbers on a page or words in a news story. I'm just going to be quiet while I share these. I saw this yesterday on Twitter. I'm a little Twitter dependent, it's true, but sometimes it really has some important information on there. This is a piece of artwork that a child with long COVID created about all the things they've been told by health practitioners, by friends, by adults. And basically, we're seeing kind of a systematic minimization of this throughout the system. And as these numbers grow, we're going to have more and more people that are impacted by this. And this is the kind of response that they're getting. It's hard for doctors to deal with this, right? Like, I think when I see a patient with long COVID, and I probably see like one a shift that admits that they've had something like this, I personally feel the first thing I need to do is validate them. This is real. You're not imagining this. I don't know how I can help you, but I'm going to try. That's basically what we need to do, because there's no cure. We don't have a medication that we can give to people. We don't have even tests that we can do to validate their subjective experience. So the only thing that we know is time. A certain number of people are going to get better with time, and that goes for adults and for children. It is fluctuating, so you can have relapses. One thing that we're really worried about and we don't know is what happens to somebody who has long COVID and then has a second infection or a third infection. Does it make their long COVID come back if it's gone already? Does it make it worse? We just don't know. We know that some people get better with vaccines. We know some people get worse with vaccines. It's old data, but my recall was 30% better, 30% worse, 30% stay the same with vaccination. And then the only thing we can offer people is symptom-specific release. So you're anxious, let's treat the anxiety. You're short of breath, let's minimize your exercise. We do know that there's some thoughts about prevention, and that would be minimizing return to normal activities as much as possible. So, you know, the classic statement is push through it, fight through it, get back on that horse. This is really a situation of sit back, relax, don't rush into things. So what do we need to do? And Goj just talked about this, and our two final guests are going to talk about this. We really need to talk about prevention. It needs to be a key consideration. So prevention means try not to get infected, essentially, which is why a lot of us are still wearing masks. We don't really know the risk of reinfection. This is a big unknown. So what does infection 2 do? What does infection 3 do as far as your risk of getting long COVID? And we don't know if there's variant-specific changes. More recently, I think we're understanding that the new variants, although being more transmissible, seem to have exactly the same risk of acute disease and probably long COVID as previous ones for the unvaccinated. So when we're seeing things like Omicron is mild, what we're really saying is Omicron is looking milder because a lot of us are well vaccinated and therefore well protected. But vaccination protection wanes, and vaccination protection may be different for each variant. Get vaccinated, it's important. I didn't really talk about adults. Overall, adults seem to have worse symptoms than kids. Highest age range is kind of 30 to 59. And guess what? That's probably most of you guys. So you are in a workspace that is dangerous because kids, basically you get 30 people in any room, whether they're kids or not. It's probably nothing to do with kids. It has to do with 30 people being in a room with probably not the best ventilation. And they're there for 8 hours a day. There's not a lot of situations in the world that are like that, right? When I go to work, I'm not sitting in the same space as everybody for 8 hours. So you guys have these unique risks, and I think that's why we're going to talk about prevention next. So I'm going to pass it back to Angela.
And stop your...
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joe. I really appreciate that. So I'll be transparent. I have long COVID. Life has been really hard for me for the last year with these persistent symptoms that just aren't going away. A year ago, I was probably in one of the best shapes of my life, like able to do whatever I wanted. And now I have to pace, manage my energy, manage my time. Fortunately, I am recovering. but this is not my real voice. Like I'm still struggling with some things. So that's a whole other discussion, because this is focused on children. But I can tell you, I am terrified for the children that have COVID and long COVID, because I have no idea what the future disability is going to be. So as a prevention specialist, that's what I've spent the last 20 years doing. I will be advocating for this, and healthy school environments. I'll shout it from the rooftops as long as it's necessary.